Hey there, it's Christian from 7 Gaming Network, and I'm here at the computer with another Star Wars Destiny video. And this time we're going to look at the problem, the issue that is Jango Fett. And the reason I'm identifying as that is because Jango is really defining our meta at the moment. So if you're playing online pretty much at all, or in any sort of half decent meta where you are, you're probably going to be coming up against Jango, and you've probably also experienced how difficult he can be to play against. And part of the reason that I wanted to make this video is I'm seeing quite a lot of people in the forums and things like that just sort of complaining, saying he's broken, he's too hard to deal with, and it's making the random element of Destiny too great. Well, I don't think that's quite true, and I'm just going to go through a whole variety of ways in which we can actually deal with Jango as we're playing, and also in our deck building when we're looking to put our decks together, especially if you know you've got Jango turning up in your meta quite frequently. So first of all, let's just have a look at him and why he's an issue, and really he's an issue because it's all down to his ability. If anything, he probably should be a bit more expensive for his ability. The reason his ability is so good, it reads, after an opponent activates a character, you may activate this character. The reason that's so good, of course, is it breaks one of the fundamental rules of Destiny, which is I go, you go. And it basically says I go again. Now there are other ways of doing that, of course, but something that's so built into a character that's it's always there at the start of every turn to deal with, is what makes Jango so good. And of course, in terms of the actual effect, it means that he's going to be able to activate Jango, your opponent, as soon as you've activated, roll out all of Jango's dice, and that could be 2, 3, 4, 5 dice, and then be able to resolve them straight away. So the problem is you don't have that opportunity to respond to what the Jango player has rolled and therefore mitigate the damage. And if Jango's got 2 jetpacks and a holdout blaster on him, he could roll 10 damage and delete a character from your team. So this is where that's where the problem is with Jango. And what it means is that when you come to play your turn, you can end up being scared to activate a character, because as soon as you do, Jango could respond and then swing in for lots of damage. So he's also got, of course, 2 range damage sides on and a melee damage side. Now, most decks, the vast majority of decks that use Jango are built with the range damage in mind, and that becomes the issue. And of course, because it's also 2 black sides, that makes it even more difficult because he's going to enable those modifiers. So how can we deal with it then? Well, first of all, without even looking at any cards, remember that you have the pass option. Now, there may come a point in a turn, of course, if you have 2 players who pass consecutively, that's the end of the round. Now, if your opponent hasn't really done anything much in a round, and he gets to the point where he's passing when he's playing Jango, you of course can pass in response and end the round, and he doesn't get to use his Jango. Now, you might say, well, yeah, but I didn't get to activate any of my characters. Okay, but if you've got to maybe play out 1 or 2 upgrades, you maybe played out a 1-cost promotion and a 1-cost blaster, or you've got out a force power, or you've got out a hunker down and a hidden in shadow, or you could have advanced your board state quite a lot, and he might have rolled out perhaps a stormtrooper or 2 stormtroopers, and you maybe dealt with those dice, or they roll blanks. He says pass, he's waiting to make the most of it. Well, you could just pass and end the turn, and he doesn't get to use his Jango. And if Jango's got upgrades on, that's pretty good. We could have avoided a lot of damage there by just doing a pass. We go straight to the next turn, we get some more resources, we could continue to build our board state, so that when we actually do choose to activate a character, they're rolling straight away maybe 4 dice or maybe even 5 dice, and we're creating the threat ourselves. So that by the time he actually comes around to activating his Jango, because he gets wise to your strategy by the end of the 2nd round or the 3rd round perhaps, actually you've got just as powerful a character, and you might roll out 7 damage in your roll, And yes, he could do the same back and deal a bunch of damage, but he's also thinking about the fact that you could still dish out a big bunch of damage. And you might make that Jango player, instead of activating in response, think, oh, well, actually I better deal with that fairly scary looking roll because you've got a character with 2 or 3 upgrades on. So actually passing over a series of turns isn't necessarily the worst thing to do if it allows you to be building your board state and you've got cards in hand that you can be playing. So the simple pass action is one you can definitely use. But really what we're looking at fundamentally is the best way to deal with Jango is to delay through the turn until you get to the point where he's either passing and then you're happy to pass, or he's like, well, I've got to go with Jango. I don't want to waste these activations with Jango when I've spent 3 resources on giving him upgrades or whatever. So he then activates his Jango character, but of course he's not going to get his ability. You have just won in that exchange then. So you're maybe asking, well, how do I delay? Well, of course I've said things like playing upgrades, but you only get 2 resources a turn, so that's probably not going to last you very long, playing upgrades. So here is a number of cards that we can use currently in the game that are great delaying cards. Now, Hunker Down is one of my favourites because it's free to play, so it's not impacting on the resources you've got available, and it's an action in itself, and then you can tap it again to get that. You can exhaust it, to get a shield on. So that's sort of 2 actions dealt with in the one free card, and it's giving you a shield, which incidentally is part of a way in which we can also help to mitigate against Jango. So Hunker Down's great for that. But what we're looking at is cards that have written on them, look, action. Okay, if you can see action there, well then that's why this is a useful card, because when it comes back to you as your action, you don't need to activate a character. You can use one of these delaying type ones. This one is to re-roll one of your dice, so you will have actually had to have activated a character at some point, but some Jango players don't necessarily always activate their Jango as soon as you activate one. Certainly not necessarily in the first round or 2. But so this is a bit of an edge case, but I would say that these other ones are fairly solid, with Hunker Down being brilliant. Now I've put Night Sister down as a slightly separate one because her action is, actually it's very reusable. All of these others need to exhaust, so you're only going to get 1 use out of them a turn. You're only getting a bit of delaying. Whereas Night Sister, as long as there are dice out on the board, you could theoretically keep re-rolling. Now that's awkward, of course, because that's going to be dealing you damage as well. And that's going to help Jango to kill the Night Sister. But if you manage to get shields onto your Night Sister, this is why I think Night Sister in the current meta is actually not terrible, could be really quite good, because of that reusable action which you can just keep reusing to delay for as long as you need to. Now I mentioned shields being another way in which we can sort of mitigate against Jango, and that's because of course he's going to roll out his dice and then get to resolve them. So if he rolls some damage, he's going to be able to apply it. But if we can get our characters all shielded up, well, naturally enough that's going to mitigate some of the damage that's incoming. So if early on you get the battlefield, it's first or second round, a dug-in can very often really neuter Jango, because Jango early game is unlikely to be rolling 10 damage. It's going to be much more likely to be something in the region of 3 to 4 to 5 maybe. Well, if you've just dug in onto the character that he wants to attack, you've just taken 3 damage off his roll. Okay, so that kind of play, it's not brilliant, it's not amazing, but it's one way in which you can help to mitigate somewhat against Jango. It's just shielding up and taking shields off your shield result die. Now again, this is another one here that's not really specifically going to counter Jango's ability, but what we do sometimes see is players can get greedy. So if you're playing against a Jango player, you might you might activate your character. He might roll Jango, and he might roll some damage, he might roll some quite decent damage, but decide that because he's wanting to maximise his turn and get more done at once, that he might also then try and roll out, say, his Balatik. So instead of resolving Jango's dice, he then rolls out, say, his Balatik dice as well, or maybe a Stormtrooper, or whatever other characters he's got in the team. Now that's the point at which you can hopefully pounce with your dodge, okay, and remove a whole bunch of cards, a whole bunch of dice. And that's where dodge is a really strong card in the meta, really, at the moment. And a lot of decks are tending to include dodge, because of that potential to remove a huge number of dice, and essentially to gain an extra turn against a Jango deck when they could do a lot of damage against you. So those kind of plays can work if you're playing against, if you know people in your meta, the Jango players are often going to try and go for the max amount of damage in one go, rather than just taking it, well, I've rolled 4 damage with Jango, I'll go with that. Dodge can be a very strong card to have in your deck as a result. Deflect for a similar sort of reason. He rolls the 1 modified side in his Jango, he tries to then roll out some more with another character, doesn't happen, you can deflect away that one black side, the straight up damage, and leave him with a bunch of modifieds that he's then got to try and get that black damage for. Now the next one I want to talk about over here is another way of dealing with Jango is to get extra actions. And how you can get extra actions is with cards like this. Now why this works, there's a little bit of timing to think about with Jango's ability, but it's ultimately that Jango's ability is it's an effect. So therefore it happens within an action, it happens as a response to an action. So if we read his card, look, it says, after an opponent activates a character, you may activate this character. So normally, of course, what that means is a player will activate their character. The effect is Jango's going to activate as well. That player then doesn't normally have another action to do. It passes back, of course, to the Jango player, and then the Jango player can resolve Jango's dice. But if you've managed to get yourself an extra action, then, for instance, let's say we're doing Tactical Mastery, you can take up to 2 additional actions after you play Tactical Mastery. As your first action, you could activate your character. Well, then the Jango player decides, am I going to activate Jango or not? Yes, I am. They activate Jango and roll him out. Well, the player who played Tactical Mastery still has another action. So if Jango does like a god roll or a really nice roll, well, then it means the player who played Tactical Mastery, us, we can do something. You know, we could play the dodge, we could deflect, we could do some sort of dice mitigation to counteract whatever Jango has just done. Now, of course, you might say a wily Jango player might say, well, I'm not going to activate then. Potentially, yes. If they don't do that, well, of course, that leaves us with another action to maybe resolve the dice that we have just rolled out. That might be really advantageous to us. So that's something the Jango player is going to have to be trying to weigh up. Does he activate now, knowing that you could mitigate his dice, or does he leave it and maybe wait until you activate another character and try and take advantage then? And that's the principle that we're using with Holdout Blaster as well, that the ambush is something that allows us to activate a character. The Jango player has to decide, what am I going to do? And then if he does activate, we've got another action that's going to happen before their action to mitigate Jango's dice and make sure that he doesn't get to activate and resolve back to back. Now there's a little bit of complexity that comes into the timing issue when you've got an ability like Jabba. And just to clear this up for you, this is the way the majority of people are playing it at the moment, and it seems to be the most correct way. When you have an action, let's say we activate Jabba, well look, he's got an ability on, after you activate this character, you may re-roll a yellow die. Well, if you read Jango, it says, after an opponent activates a character, you may activate this character. So we've got a problem here because we've got two effects that are both happening after an activate. So essentially we've got two simultaneous effects. Now of course we can't resolve things simultaneously, especially when Jabba's ability, of course, could re-roll a yellow die. It could re-roll one of the dice that Jango rolls out. So just to help you guys with sort of rules issues here and how we can deal with Jango, this when this happens, when these two simultaneous abilities are going to take place and which one goes first, because they're simultaneous abilities going off, is decided by the player who controls the battlefield. Okay, so if you're in control of the battlefield, and let's say you're the one activating Jabba, if the Jango player says, I would like to activate Jango, you get to decide then whether you would say, okay, you activate Jango and we get to see what he rolls, and then I can re-roll one of Jango's dice with my Jabba ability. And that's how that can work, and that's a little extra way in which, if you're playing Jabba, who's a very popular character to play, against a Jango, then you can go for activating Jabba first, and Jabba works quite well being activated first because he's got the discard, he's got the disrupt, he's got the focus to enable other dice that you're maybe going to roll after. So rolling Jabba early is often a good ploy anyway, and he is a character that has a slight bit of inbuilt mitigation against Jango if you have the battlefield. Otherwise, it's up to the Jango player. If he's got the battlefield, he might say, no, do your Jabba reroll first, then I'm going to roll out all my Jango dice. Okay, so just another little thing to bear in mind. Now, the reason I've got these three cards in here is one of the ways in which I think further that we can deal with Jango is to somehow deal with his dice. If Jango is activating and rolling out 3, 4, 5 dice, that's when he gets really scary because his potential damage output really increases. So if we can deal with that, well, that's brilliant. We really want to do that. So disarm is a very good way to sort of neuter Jango. Often you'll see early game, often the very first play of a Jango deck will be jetpack onto Jango or F11D rifle onto Jango. Well, if we can get a disarm off and disarm that dice from Jango at some point in that first turn, really advantageous position to be in, because Jango, when he rolls then, is likely to deal less damage. He's less of a threat. Prized possession works on the same basis. We can take away a Jango dice, and a good example, if you're doing something like, if you're playing against a Jango, with a jetpack on, well, he absolutely needs that black damage to enable things like the modifieds on the jetpack or on the holdout blaster or the guns. So if we can prize possession one of Jango's dice, especially if you're playing a single version of Jango, that's really, really powerful. That's going to really neuter Jango's impact on the game. And finally, confiscation as well. Quite a lot of Jango decks don't necessarily run with lots of resources. There is a variation out there that's quite good. Jango 2 Stormtroopers uses underworld connections to enable late game endless ranks. Now that deck can have quite a lot of resources available, so confiscation's not going to be so great then. But if you're playing Jango Ibalatik Stormtrooper, they often sort of bounce along on 1 or 2 resources every turn, and that's what they run on. So a confiscation with good timing can be really nasty, especially if you've got any disrupt dice. Because again, if you can stop Jango having upgrades on him, well, he's a lot less scary when he gets to roll and resolve back to back. So there's just a few little tips and ideas and ways in which I have, I put the battlefield up there earlier on because I wanted to talk about the battlefield and how things like that interact with the timing on Jabba and his ability. But there's a few little ideas there on how you can deal with Jango because he is a threat, he is a problem, but he's not undealable with. There are plenty of ways that they've designed the game for us to be able to mitigate Jango. And one thing I would say is the majority of the time as well, he is going to be your first target. So when you do get chance to roll out and get your damage out onto your opponent's team. If he's playing Jango, probably 8 times out of 10 you're going to be focusing Jango down to get rid of him, because he's going to be the main threat and he's going to dictate how you play with your delays and with your and everything else. So I hope that was helpful. As ever, leave comments, get in touch with me. You can find me on the Discord channel, the Knights of Ren Discord channel. I'm Peace Lord on that. And just as a bit of a shout as well to the Knights of Ren guys, if you haven't checked out their podcast yet, it really is a fantastic podcast. And if you haven't visited swdestiny.com, that is another fantastic site as well. I just want to say thanks to them for hosting all of these 7 Gaming Network videos. There'll be plenty more, guys, for you all to enjoy. So until then, keep enjoying Destiny.